So at the time in which I'm seeing a case, there's normally an issue of some sort or somewhere, either abuse, neglect, lack of appropriate supervision, just these various things that are going on in that child's life.
Pulaski County 10th Division Juvenile Judge Shanice Johnson.
All the families that I see before me have at some point in their life, either the parents or the children that are impacted or experience ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. And the significance of ACEs is that individuals who experience ACEs have a lower life expectancy, engage in more risky behavior, and it significantly impacts their decision making and the outcomes that they receive and experience in life.
This is Season 1, Episode 5 of the Smart Justice Podcast, Trauma's Long-Term Impact.
Crime and punishment are hot topics. Are there solutions different than what we're hearing about at a national level?
We led the nation in all the wrong categories, especially when it came to child welfare and recidivism. Like, why are we dead last?
Now we're seeing illicit fentanyl as the #1 drug threat in our state, backed very closely with methamphetamine.
If you really want to focus on the kids, stop acting like you're going to use foster care to punish parents.
There is a different way to approach justice that has better return on investment.
Working with families on the prevention end is more cost effective than placing them in foster care.
That seems to strengthen both law enforcement and courts and tie that together with community resources.
Justice has to be served for civil society to exist, but the place of mercy falls in the hands of the people.
And then track the impact to communities and better outcomes. And we're calling this approach Smart Justice.
Smart Justice is a work of Restore Hope and partner organizations. Restore Hope is a software and services organization that helps communities achieve better outcomes for justice and child welfare efforts. Smart Justice is focused on optimizing the system by improving the relationships among its parts. Paul, as we've been proceeding through the Smart Justice podcast, our previous episodes, it seems like in almost every case, whether it be foster care, incarceration, addiction, and substance abuse issues, it seems like the word that keeps popping up time and time again is trauma. So how is it that trauma is so much a part of all of these various justice involvement issues that we keep running into?
I think it comes from the realization of once you start looking at the individuals that are in the justice system, whether they be in jail or they're stuck in district court or they have child welfare issues, or all three of those things are going on at the same time, then what we see is that the individuals that are stuck, when we start understanding what their life was like when they grew up, it was usually a pretty chaotic event. There might have been physical abuse, sexual abuse, there could be poverty-related things. They were hungry, they were always bouncing around, just trying to survive. And now what we know from decades of research is that when you grow up in an environment that's chaotic like that, it starts to, well, we've got hard numbers on the predictive outcomes, both medically, and that was a big surprise. The understanding of adverse childhood experiences first came about in the medical field.
My name is Dr. Rose Smith. I'm a clinical psychologist, and my background is in doing post-traumatic stress disorder research, but my main background is in studying the effects of trauma on women and children and how that affects the family system. So when we define trauma, it has to involve sort of feeling like your physical integrity or someone close to you's physical integrity might be in danger. But adverse childhood experiences, we've learned, those are things like a parent going to jail or being in condition of poverty or having a parent that has a substance abuse disorder. That doesn't necessarily mean that your life was threatened, but what we've learned through research is that these adverse childhood experiences, especially when accumulated, create the same type of neurological, psychological, and behavioral response that childhood trauma would. And so we now take these adverse childhood experiences just as seriously as we would, let's say, if a child was maybe beaten or was molested by a family member. We now know that living in poverty, living in a crime-ridden neighborhood, having a parent removed from the home for going to prison or jail, that those have the same types of impacts on the brain, on the development of the child, and on the family system that a true trauma would. It basically came out of this body of research that we see people that don't formally have post-traumatic stress disorder because they either don't meet the diagnostic criteria of having had an actual trauma, like being assaulted or whatever, but they have the same clinical outcomes and manifestations of people that have post-traumatic stress disorder. So they're suffering from a variety of like mental illnesses, physical illnesses, PTSD-like symptoms, behavioral issues, etc. And so physicians and therapists and psychiatrists all kind of were trying to sort out, okay, well, what is this phenomena that we're seeing of these really difficult childhood environments? They're mimicking the fallout that we would see from classic post-traumatic stress disorder, which is poor health outcomes, poor mental health outcomes, poor interpersonal outcomes, etc. How do we reconcile those? And so what became developed was the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale, which looked at these other stressors that impact what we call the allostatic load. That's the load that of sort of like neurological and physiologic stress that somebody can experience. My dissertation and a lot of the research I did in graduate school was on methamphetamine use and trauma. And so I went out and recruited methamphetamine users in Northwest Arkansas. And many of them did not actually have formal traumas. So they had never been assaulted, they had not been in the military, they had not been in a tornado, a car accident, but they still manifested these clinical symptoms that looked a lot like PTSD, and they also had the same physical health outcomes, the same kind of psychosocial outcomes. And so, you know, that's one good anecdote of just living in a culture where people are in and out of prison, where they're exposed to illicit substances, poverty, things like that, creates what looks a lot like post-traumatic stress disorder. But it posed a real problem in my dissertation because, you know, right now the American Psychiatric Association is still really focused on keeping post-traumatic PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder as its own sort of like diagnostic category, which requires a trauma. And so it was challenging of like, well, what do we do with all these people that have clearly had what you and I would consider to be a traumatic life, but it doesn't meet the medical definition of trauma?
And I'd like to also point out that understanding that someone had traumatic events or had hard times in no way excuses criminal behavior. But if we're going to try to solve the problem of less incarceration and needing foster care less, given the expense to the taxpayer and the social expense to the families, then we need to understand the problem more. And trauma is one of those areas which we need to have a real understanding on so that we can employ proper remedies to it. So resilience, helping people overcome that traumatic event. And mostly we need to figure out how do we minimize trauma for kids in our communities today so that they're not dealing with these types of issues 15 years from now, and we as a community are not paying for them, wondering where they came from. We are sowing seeds today in our communities in Arkansas that we will reap 10, 15, and 20 years down the road. There's a layman's test that you can take that shows you, based upon how you grew up, the environment that you grew up in, and the situations that you encountered in that environment?
So you can actually go online and take it. It's the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. That's what ACEs stands for. And it essentially asks you a series of questions about kind of what went on in your childhood environment.
And so all these are prior to your 18th birthday. Did any of these things occur? One is, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, humiliate you, or act in any way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? So the threat of physical violence would be one, and that's a yes or a no. And if it's a yes, you get 1 point. And so that's important. So number two, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, throw something at you, or ever hit you? So, an often physical violence that you were afraid of or encountered. 3, did an adult or other person at least 5 years older than you ever touch you, fondle you, or have you touched their body parts in any sexual way? So was there sexual abuse from an older person in the home? 4, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought that you were important or special? And so it would be kind of an emotional neglect. 5, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat or had to wear dirty clothes and you had no one to protect you, so you were kind of all out on your own? 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? 7, was your mother or stepmother abused, physically abused in the home? 8, did you live with anyone who was a drinker, alcoholic, or used street drugs? 9, was there a household member that was depressed or mentally ill? Or did anyone attempt suicide? And then lastly, did a household member go to prison? These events or situations have an impact on a child. The predictive outcomes are fairly certain now. Like I've heard the statistics. So if you answered yes to 4 or more of those questions, then it starts to move into an area where you're going to have significant barriers to overcome. Like physically, you're going to be more than 400% more likely for chronic bronchitis. Now, why is that? And I think that's a mix of the cortisol that's constantly being released as you're trying to survive, and maybe your behaviors. Maybe you're smoking, which is not good for your lungs. If you have 6 or more, you can mark 20 years off kind of life expectancy because, again, of the medical impact, but also the environment that you're likely to find yourself in. Again, these are not certainties. They're just predictions.
I mean, I hate as a therapist to say that something's like inevitable, right? I mean, that's kind of giving up on the idea of behavior change. What I will say is that it puts them at incredibly high risk. I mean, we're all born with genetic vulnerabilities to something bad. I mean, all of us have some kind of either, cancer, or diabetes, or, proneness to hypertension or depression in our DNA. And, the higher your ACEs score is, the more likely you are to end up manifesting those illnesses. So I don't want to say inevitable, but I would say that it's pretty close. Part of the issue with ACEs is that it's environmental, right? So they're living in poverty, there's food shortage, they don't know when mom's gonna get home because she's doing shift work because dad's in prison. And so, a lot of the treatments that one would come up with are community-based or psychosocial. It's like, how do we change the system that keeps putting children and developing minds at risk? Then there's sort of like the back end of it where, yes, we can treat the depression or the trauma symptoms or the diabetes, but prevention and a change in the way that the system itself works would be like, if I had a magic wand, that would be the way to fix it, right? Because it's really, really tough to ask a kid or even a grown-up, okay, come see me for 2 hours a week and we'll work on your depression, and then throw them right back into the environment that's generating this chronic stress. I mean, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I would say it's very difficult.
Data shows that children that are in foster care long term do not have, wonderful outcomes.
Karen Phillips, director of the 100 Families Initiative.
You can, read over and over again about the outcomes of children in foster care, and it's largely due to trauma that they have faced when being removed. And people a lot of times don't, understand or can visualize that trauma, but if you just place yourself in the child's shoes for a moment and know that that child has connections with their parents, they love their parents, they have connections with aunts and uncles and grandparents and neighbors, and they have teachers that they have connections with, and all of a sudden every single connection in their life is cut. They have to move into a different home, oftentimes a different school, new friends. Everyone is new in their life, and that is traumatic. And children don't know how to show how traumatic that is or talk about how traumatic that is. They definitely show it. You can tell through their behavior that something is wrong, and that they just don't know how to process or talk about their feelings. They just know they feel a certain way. They don't even understand exactly why.
Dr. Andrew Baker, Harding University professor and longtime foster parent.
I have a friend at Harding who directs our counseling program. And when you start talking about trauma, right, and almost all of the people who you deal with in child welfare are living through trauma, just the simple experience of a child being removed is traumatic. Not to mention the layers of trauma that most have experienced in their life, right? And Dr. Patton will talk about how in trauma, one of the challenges is for us to understand success isn't moving past trauma. Success is the longer you go between having something that becomes a traumatic experience to having something else that becomes a traumatic experience, because you're not going to get rid of it, right? So my success, right, is not that, oh, I'm all good. My success is I went longer between this and the next time I acted out, right? Like I have a kid who's had severe trauma in his life and living in our home. Well, there's not a magic wand to fix the kid, and it doesn't exist, right? But to know, you know what? We kept a record and we went 5 days without having a major blow up. Well, we had a blow up on the 5th day. Well, what happened? What was the catalyst to that? Let's try to make sure we don't do that again, right? And so using that as an example, I don't know of a kid who woke up today to say, I want to raise all the hell I can. But he made it till about 10 a.m. and he's already started. Why? Well, most of the time there's something back there that explains the action. Again, I am nowhere a person trying to justify actions that are not good. But I am a person that says, but what makes an action make sense? Why would someone do fill in the blank? And so when you get in a context, in a community, this is complex. If this was easy, it had been done, right? And it becomes more complex with a new generation of kids, right? You start going to family court as often as I've sat in the back of the room, and you start saying, that's grandma, and that's mom, and that's kid, and that's great. Man, they all in here. Okay, what's going on?
Dana Baker, director of 100 Families, White County, Arkansas.
We actually have seen here in White County 3 generations of kids that have been in foster care. We have the 3rd generation of children that have been in care. And a lot of that is poverty. And it's also not having the support and the role models, the parent modeling that we expect that you and I would have. They haven't had that for generation upon generation upon generation. Kids that are in foster care have a lot of trauma. They are often moved from house to house to house. They're not with their siblings. They change schools over and over. They are going to have a lot of trauma and sometimes react negatively. They're going to have a lot of behavior issues. They may have had a lot of emotional problems coming into this. And sometimes kids that are left in care for a long time will have will turn to substance abuse as older teenagers or as young adults.
And we know that if children are taken into foster care or a parent is incarcerated, that's a traumatic event. Children are removed from their parents, either by the parent being removed from them and incarcerated, or the children being placed in a foster home or a group home somewhere apart from their parents. So that's traumatic, and that is going to show up in adulthood in that child's life as a barrier to success and happiness. But for the adult, it's a traumatic event also. So being incarcerated is traumatic in itself.
My friend Charles Benson and myself speaking with Paul Chapman.
The trauma in the community from going to prison is most guys that get out of prison have a psychological issue. They have something wrong.
You're gonna be off a little bit.
That's what I mean. They can be off.
I call it the decompression phase.
We call it he ain't rap tight.
Yeah, he ain't rap tight.
He ain't rap tight no more. You can't get right. You can't get right. No matter how hard you try, that trauma is so thick. It's thick like gravy. You ever had turkey and gravy at Thanksgiving? That gravy in our community, boy, they make that gravy, boy, it's so thick and good. Yeah. And that's how thick the trauma is. It's just stuck there, and you have to. You can't water it down because it's so thick and it's so much. It's so many men and women that's been to prison. So many people getting out traumatized, getting out with that psychological baggage, and that we don't know how to get rid of it. We're just stuck in limbo.
My name is Billy Inman, and in November retired from the Department of Correction. 27 years there. The last 7 I was a deputy warden. I'd like to see the effects PTSD has on incarcerated folks and PTSD. I know correctional officers have a high rate of PTSD. If you think about it, they're amongst folks every day, 12 hours a day. That's got to have an impact of what you're seeing every day. But then if you're living in the barracks and you're living, me and some of the guys in the jail, the incarcerated guys, had a conversation about PTSD and how when you get out, you're not very trustful of things, not very trustful of the system, not very, the rules that you have to obey in the prison. A lot of times we take those outside the prison. And so just the emotional things you have to go through every day. If you can imagine, living in a barracks of 40 or 50 men every day, not all of them have your best interest at heart.
If you're in jail or prison, there is a certain amount of just daily survival that goes on. Dealing with the other people that are incarcerated with you, some of which may be experiencing real anger and may be really dangerous, some that have severe and persistent mental health issues, and so they're unable to operate in the world and perceive the world and with kind of reality.
When I worked at the acute day treatment program, we had lots of people that had been in prison or jail, and they went into prison or jail with some kind of mental health diagnosis or substance abuse, but they would come out of prison with that existing diagnosis plus PTSD because they were traumatized in jail or prison. I mean, the violence level inside of prisons is tremendous, right? I mean, it's like sending somebody to Afghanistan, essentially. So, this place where we're rehabbing people to bring them back to society, we're essentially putting them at risk, re-traumatizing them. They're already likely to have had childhood trauma and creating more mental health diagnoses. So, changing the prison system so that it actually helps people as opposed to, ignites further mental illness, further drive towards criminal activity and substance abuse, etc. I think that culturally there is less and less stigma about post-traumatic stress disorder, and at the same time I think that we still mentally confine it to sort of like textbook examples. So veterans or somebody who was sexually assaulted, for example, and we don't think about some of the more complex types of trauma where there's multiple traumas within a family environment, etc. So I think there's a lack of knowledge about it still that's pretty profound, and how widespread it is. And so we don't do a good job of identifying it. And then there's naturally the shame that's associated typically with having been traumatized. So I think there's just a lack of education about PTSD out there, that we still have this very narrow, sort of like Vietnam veteran mentality about what can cause PTSD. And so there are these, huge areas too where we just ignore trauma because we blame it on the victim, as opposed to recognizing that it's, still a trauma and still a part of this systemic issue. Whether you're a felon or not, if somebody pulls a gun on you, that's a trauma. So, and that's one of the things that I think gets looked over and glossed over a lot, and that's victim blaming, right? And we know not to victim blame a 5-year-old who says they've been sexually assaulted, but we still victim blame a felon who has been assaulted, right? Because you shouldn't have been in that position. And it's inherently unjust and unfair, but people are still pretty invisible to it.
And in no way am I justifying crime and hurting people, and I'm very much pro safety in our communities, but as leaders trying to figure out how we get better outcomes, then we have to understand what our interventions, the unintended consequences of interventions, so that we can have better solutions. All these things just kick in your survival instinct, and if you are living in a survival kind of mindset, you're just trying to maintain your safety, figure out how you can, everyone's fighting for the same, set of limited resources, that often prevents your ability to think abstractly. And almost all high-paying jobs that are legal today require you to engage in abstract thought. Gone are the days in which we have people that are just on an assembly line doing repetitive tasks. What we need now is people that understand how to keep the robot doing the repetitive task, how to fix the robot when the line goes down, how to optimize the flow, and that, and to be able to do that, you have to be able to understand at a higher level. You've got to engage. You've got to have enough stability to be able to engage that part of your brain that allows you to understand.
I like to use a physical analogy. So imagine that your leg bones are trying to grow, right? And somebody every day just whacks your leg bones. It's gonna affect how they're shaped, right? And it's gonna affect their ability to function and work. So, all of us are born with this normal developmental trajectory of how our brain should be developing. And that's psychosocially how we relate to other people, that's mathematically, that's how we move our body, that's how we problem solve, that's how we think through future decision making. All of that has a very normal trajectory. It's supposed to, and for the most part, we're all born with that system intact. But if you go back to that analogy of me whacking on a little kid's bones every single day, their leg bones aren't going to develop properly. Well, imagine that happening to the entire brain, to the entire nervous system as it's developing. It's going to completely change the trajectory of all of it. And so it literally affects everything. I mean, it affects how the brain develops, it affects how our executive functioning develops, which is the part of our brain that controls impulses and helps us plan for the future and makes good choices. It affects problem solving. I mean, literally every single cognitive domain it affects. It's shaping and molding, the chronic stress is shaping and molding how the brains are developing themselves. It's really, really tragic, actually.
We talked a little bit about that ACE test. You remember that test? It's got those 10 questions.
We took that test.
Yeah, and it's kind of predictive. It doesn't say for certain these are the things, but you know, the more you've got there, they've kind of the science behind it says that certain things are more likely to happen. Like if you got 4 more on that test, you're over 400% more likely to have chronic bronchitis as an adult. You're 1,200% more likely to attempt suicide as an adult. So that's kind of the way that some of these traumatic things are coming out: physical abuse, sexual abuse, like hungry, on a regular basis. Had a parent locked up before you were 18.
I took that test, and mine was 6, so I was 2 over 4. So I didn't know I was that traumatized. I didn't know I had been through that high of a degree of traumatic experiences. Me personally, I went through counseling. Through the last 2 years, I've been going through counseling, and it helped a lot. It helped me get out off my chest what I've been through, why I went through it, why my decisions were bad or good in certain cases. I want to announce to my community that everyone needs therapy. Therapy is very important because we all have some kind of traumatic baggage that we don't know. It's psychological. It's probably way back in your mind. You don't remember it. It was a kid, but you don't want to think about it. You buried it, but it's there. And once I started talking about it with my therapist, it just started flowing. I started expressing myself, and he started giving me more feedback and got to know me more. It changed me. It kind of, I'm already aggressive. I think I'm already aggressive, and sometimes, but it kind of softened me a little bit, and it kind of helped me to look at other people's aspect. Instead of being selfish and just thinking about me, I started looking at what other people might have been through. So I can't get mad at what you're doing because you've been through something traumatic too. So you might not even know you're disrespecting me, and I think you're disrespecting. So in the community, trauma is so prevalent. It's like, it's deep.
It's everywhere.
It's so deep. Talking things out is so therapeutic. I didn't know it.
Get unstuck is what they're saying. So all those traumatic things that may have accumulated, you're 6.
Yep.
And it may not even take that much. It's just they pile on one another. But what the data shows is oftentimes it's going to keep you stuck in some way. Maybe you can't trust people, so your relationships aren't good.
I don't trust people well. I didn't.
And it can affect your health in the community.
Yes.
Cancer. Physical health, for sure.
To
this day, I
you don't sleep well.
Nice, I can't sleep. Certain days I might be up 3-4, and that's still to this day.
A lot of the diseases in our community can be traced back to traumatic experiences.
That was how it was originally found. There was a doctor that was over in California, and he was treating a lot of obese clients. He was trying to help them lose weight. They were morbidly obese. And what he started to find was that many of them had actually been seriously abused as children. He was like, wait a minute, how is that impacting your physical health? And so they put all this together. And so the hospitals now know, they call it social determinants of health, but some of the biggest impacts to my physical health right now have nothing to do with the medical care that's available. It's my behaviors and my background and how work is going, how my relationship with my wife and my kids are going.
So it's mental.
There's a direct connection between your environment, whether it be stressful or healthy, and your physical health.
Right.
So any disease that's affected by cortisol, which is the stress hormone, the inflammatory stress hormone, all of those diseases are more prevalent in people with high ACEs. So that basically is essentially almost every physical illness you can think of. But, the classic, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, and autoimmune disorders are what come to the forefront.
Plus, it also impacts my decisions.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Do I drink too much? Am I using drugs to try to escape? I just want to feel a little good. And so, am I bouncing around relationships because it felt good right then? Now, it never feels good long, but you're always trying to chase some little bit of help to just make you forget about how painful
it's a temporary
life
fix.
is. It's a temporary fix. Usually comes with its own baggage.
Yes. And outcome, the aftermath is
not good.
Not good at all.
So if someone is listening to this podcast and they've heard us walk through the 10 items on the ACEs test, and all of a sudden they're thinking, oh my goodness, that applies to me. that sounds like my life. What are steps they might take to help themselves now that they're realizing maybe the ACEs test applies to their life a little bit more than they thought?
Right. So I'd say a couple of things. One is educate yourself. You can go to the CDC website and look up ACEs, or just Google CDC and adverse childhood experiences. And there's a lot of information that's there. Number two is I would seek an appropriate counselor who's trauma informed and understands how this, they've been through the appropriate training, and seek some counseling. I would imagine that if you took the test and you saw that there were some traumatic events in your life, that if you're listening to this, you probably are at a point where you're realizing that some of that now is playing itself out in your relationships, in your work, and in the way that you kind of perceive yourself now. And so I'd say if that's you, please do your research. And please go find a counselor who is trauma informed so that you can work this out. Because as we talked in previous episodes, kind of the meta analysis on all of this is that our relationships and the depth of our relationships are the things that are the most important. It's the relationships that we have with our higher power. It's the relationships that we have with our family and with our loved ones. It's the relationships that we have with our friends. And it's the relationships and your ability to find meaning and value at work that constitute a life that leads to satisfaction. And so those barriers, those things that happened to you as a child are going to impact your ability to have those relationships and to do that work and to do it in a way that ultimately brings you satisfaction and meaning in your life. And therefore it's worth going and with a skilled therapist bringing that up and dealing with it in an appropriate way.
That's the best thing about our community. We trying to heal. It's a long process, but we healing. We're healing slowly, because we had we lost a lot of good people around there. We miss them, and then this homeboy might have did this to this homeboy, so we're healing slowly. We're trying to heal a lot of those wounds. Some people still don't like other people, and it's understandable.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because
it's some trauma.
And when lives are taken, people, you know what I'm saying? And
it's hard to get over.
Right.
It's very hard.
It's hard to get over,
Very
and then it might affect 30 families. That one murder affect 30 families. Yep. And then the other side of them 30 families, they lost this person to incarceration. So it's a lot of healing going on right now. And we seen the most amazing thing, me making a CJ. A woman's son was murdered. She is now advocating for the murder of her son to get out.
Yes. It was amazing. I couldn't believe that.
Right.
I never saw that.
I never
saw that
in my life, you know. And she sends us money on his book, and she's advocating.
She goes to the parole board when he goes up and talks for him. The man that killed her son. Her son's no longer here. You know what she did? We forgot. She adopted him as her son. He told her, he wrote her a letter, he said, "I'm your son now. I took your son from you. I'm your son now." She has a new son now. You know what a mother does? You know, women don't play about their children, especially their sons. They go to war about them. She's going to war about this young man getting back out and getting a second chance at life. Now that's forgiveness. That's the ultimate form of forgiveness. Right. Forgiving someone that took your child's life and you want them back out in these streets to live a better life. You can't say that's love right there.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Smart Justice. If you find yourself stuck in a disruptive cycle that may be caused by unresolved trauma, we encourage you to seek professional counseling to find healing and hope. Join us next episode for a discussion about finding a way forward. Thank you again.
Thanks to our guests, Judge Shanice Johnson, Dr. Rose Smith, Karen Phillips, Dr. Andrew Baker, Dana Baker, Billy Inman, Charles Benson, and Charles Newsom. And thanks to Churches for Life for sponsoring. Musical credits include H2O by Lee of the Stone, I Dream in 3 by J. Carr, Lonely Company by Anthony Catacoli, and Love and Truth by Cast of Characters. Music is licensed through soundstripe.com. Smart Justice is a work of Restore Hope. Please consider helping us produce more work like this by becoming a sponsor at www.smartjustice.org. Thank you again.